It will be.
Okay, good. Creating an OpenVMS virtual machine on ESXi. A disclaimer. Since Broadcom has taken over VMware, it's a pain in the neck to deal with them. We have an incredibly difficult time downloading their software. That's what it says on their website. It doesn't work well. Back in the old days, it was pretty simple. You had typically a support an account, and you could easily download it. You get a 60-day trial license, and it worked out really well. Our IT group is having trouble pulling it down. They've got all kinds of access. So good luck to you. But that's what VMware says to do. So those are the current versions. We are not running any of them because we can't get them. Seriously. So it shouldn't make a difference as long as you're running 8 or 7. I think we also support 6.7, although we're not running that in-house.
At least it's working. I don't know if it's support.
We claim support, so it should be working. So if you've got questions, just fire away. Don't hold them to the end. So this is on the main screen where you'll find the version you're running in case you're actually wondering what version you're running. So after you've installed ESXi, I wasn't planning on going through that. There's a couple of things you need to do to actually make it usable. I'm not claiming this is best practice. I'm saying this is what I do and it works for me. So there's a couple of things you need to enable in order to give console access to ESXi. On this screen, I'm not sure if you can see back there, but this is what the services screen looks like. You need to right click on
Remote, it didn't work well.
yeah, actually, this is mine.
Oh.
No. Well, it advances correctly. Well, oh, let's try this. Ah, there we go. This is Paul's. Anyway, so you've got 2 services here, and you can see here I've got them running. They are off by default, but if you right-click on the service name and then go to Policy and then select Start and Stop a Host, that's how you enable it. That may or may not be acceptable to your local security policies. Also, disabling the ESXi firewall, which once again might not be good for your security policies, but it makes it a lot easier to manage. It's relatively straightforward once you've got console access to disable the firewall. You can either set default to pass traffic, or you can just disable it entirely. I just tend to disable it entirely, and once again, once you've done that, you can just verify that what you hope to have happen didn't in fact happen. Among the reasons why you want to give access to ESXi natively is so you can move ISO images onto ESXi, so you can actually boot a virtual CD. There's no recommended place, although I assume the goal is to stick it in this directory. This is a default directory that's created as part of the installation. And you can see here I've got E923, B922, and a Rocky distro. Let's get going. On the main screen, this is how you start to create a virtual machine. So who in here is already using ESXi and has actually run a VMS virtual machine? All right, so that's almost half. So if you've got any questions, as I said, yell them out. If you disagree with what I put up here, let me know, because as I said, this works for me, but it might not be the best way. All right. Most of these screens are pretty intuitive, and this presentation is probably going to run pretty quickly because it really is quite easy. On this first screen, you need to give it the name and the family and let's see, I guess that's yes, the OS version. If we had VMS here in the dropdown, which we likely never will, it would make a lot of this a lot easier, because as you see later, there's a couple undocumented settings that you must set. And if we could actually select VMS as a dropdown, that would get taken care of for you automatically. But we don't rate with VMware. So we've tried and we've had interesting experiences trying to communicate with them. It was only because I think Gary was able to contact someone in a forum and got some pretty detailed information about how to actually get this thing to work that we've actually were able to finally make some progress. Selecting your storage. At this point, you're not creating a disk. You're just selecting the type of storage where your virtual disk will be created. In this hypervisor, I have both local storage, and you can see this one's called SAN MSA 2040, which is to say this is fiber channel storage presented to the hypervisor itself. This is not fiber channel pass-through, which is something that Paul will discuss at the next session. This is actually just storage for ESXi itself. A benefit is that fiber channel storage is usually quicker than local storage. So if you have the option of doing this, I certainly recommend it. This is where the fun begins, because this is where you actually get to customize the important settings for the virtual machine itself. There's nothing particularly magical yet going on here. The number of CPUs, there's an earlier session yesterday where I mentioned that you probably don't want to use more than 8. I mean, we support up to 32 and probably up to 64 with some conditions. But previous studies have shown that after 8, your mileage may vary and not in a good way. So I don't even know if we're documenting this recommendation, but in general, try to keep it to fewer than 8.
Well, that's, I don't think that's me. Yeah, I've heard,
I don't doubt that, but I know specifically with us, it's not looked good. Memory. That is going to be dependent upon how much you have in your hypervisor. In my hypervisor, I've got 256 gig, so I'm typically doling out 32 gig partitions, but you don't really want to oversubscribe if possible. One other thing, I'm not planning on discussing vCenter in this presentation because it's not something I've used. vCenter is something you need to use if you want to use vMotion, which I'm not using. But vCenter constrains you to make sure that you cannot oversubscribe. vCenter is useful in some respects, but it can also get in the way of certain operations. So for one-off hypervisors, which this is, we don't use vCenter. For the disk controller, we recommend the LSI Logic Parallel. We also recommend fixed provision. Should make a difference whether it's lazily or eagerly zero. For the network adapters, you can choose one of E1000, 1000E, or the virtualized VMXNet 3. VMXNet 3 should theoretically give you a little better performance because it's para-virtualized.
You actually now support VMS networks.
We do now, yeah. So on this hypervisor, I've got 2 network adapters that are connected. You can see here they're enabled and connected. The first adapter is used for the hypervisor itself. The second one is going to be primarily for virtual machines. And you can see here, this is looking at the vSwitch that is created by default for the adapters. vSwitch 0 corresponds to that first adapter that I showed you. And you can see here, there are a couple virtual machines, but in general, it's used for the hypervisor. Another interesting thing here is the security policy. Here, by default, those 3 settings are set to no, which is fine for the hypervisor itself. However, for the adapter that I'm using for the virtual machines, I've set all of those 3 to be yes. And this is one of those things where I did early on because it worked. And This shows you how to change that in the edit settings. This is where you would actually swap them from no to yes. Regarding the security changes, and this is directly from Dick Stockdale, who was our Ethernet driver. So what he says is absolutely correct. The point being that to run DECnet, you absolutely do need the bottom one set to BS for allow MAC changes. As it turns out, promiscuous mode probably does not need to be set, and forged transmits likely does not need to be set. However, I do run with them all enabled, and everything works perfectly. I'm running both DECnet phase 4 and phase 5 with no trouble. So now we're going to do some of the more interesting things. This is where we set up the virtual DVD. So the default for the DVD is the host device, which we don't want. We're going to use the ISO file. So what happens is when you select that, it opens up the data store browser. Then you need to navigate down to where the ISO is stuffed. If you recall back in an earlier slide, I moved it to the ISO images tool, the VM images tools ISO images. So there's the VM images, and we've selected tools ISO images. And I don't know if you can see it because it's kind of blued out, but that's the E923 ISO. So we're going to connect that up to the virtual. And you can see there, the path name is correct. Now we're going to add the serial device for the console. Select serial port. The option, there are several options. We use network. Then you need to give it protocol and a port number. I use Telnet, and I just happen to choose port 2040 there. The syntax is a little funky. It's Telnet : / port number. And here's where some of the customization comes in. You need to change the firmware from BIOS to EFI, or else you won't get anywhere. And then we go to edit the configuration, and we need to add some parameters. And this is where the funky stuff comes in, the undocumented stuff that Gary was able to sort out. Those are the 3 parameters. And the spacing, the capitalization is very, very significant. And if you screw this up, it won't tell you until you go to create the virtual machine, in which case we'll say, yeah, that's not right. So don't have a trailing space at the end.
Oh.
So anyway, that's the words on those 3 parameters that are required. And once again, thank Gary Newstead for this information. But this stuff is critical to getting the virtual machine to actually.
The need for this is negated by the guest console, potentially negated a little bit by the guest console in the 923, right?
Gary?
Oh, look, maybe the first one, the serial console enabled. If the one that says shell active by default, if you want to be able to access the UEFI shell at all, that has to be enabled. And then the last one, quick boot. The thinking from VMware there is that if you have a huge machine with lots and lots of devices, it's going to take a long time to map all those devices. And so they try to map only the one boot device, and just the minimum amount of hardware. But VMS, you want to be able to select your boot device. So you really need to enumerate all the devices. That's kind of up to you. If you're set up with just a single boot device, you can probably get away with that.
But I comment not all the devices, but need to be enumerated on the devices which can be boot devices.
Well, it also-
Alternate boots.
It also will probe, you know, if you're hooked up with fiber channel, it's gonna search the fiber channel. It could
That
take
could be
up
a
to
long
several
time.
minutes. You know,
Several minutes, I
Yes.
guess tens of minutes.
yeah, well, that's several.
Been there, done that.
I'm a very patient guy, that's several minutes.
So Bob, how many devices did you have at that point when you were waiting that long?
50 to 100 logical devices. It was amazingly sluggish.
Huh.
And the thing is, BMS will, for data with the disks, it'll do it on its own.
So,
The problem is the EFI boot menu. If you have
Yeah.
contingency boots from different, for example, you're doing middle of a potential fallback to a previous version of BMS or an unupdated version of BMS, you need to have all the devices that will be used in the boot menu enumerated.
Yeah.
But you do not need the plethora of virtualized logical volumes
Yep.
that you might have. One thing I've noticed is we used to be limited in how many volumes you had by how many physical drives you had. Now that we've got enterprise storage arrays that allocate LBN
Yeah.
chunks, you can create half a terabyte or 50K or anywhere in between. So what tends to happen is you tend to proliferate volumes by need because it doesn't cost you anything, and administratively it can become simpler. But that also means enumeration can be long, but
Yep.
unnecessarily long.
Anyway, those are important.
I would also add that, and this is from VMware, there are hundreds of parameters like this that are undocumented. There's bells and whistles you wouldn't believe beside VMware. And,
VirtualBox has the same disease.
yeah,
Look at the manual. The manual is the size of conch.
they openly admit that they're a little behind that documentation.
So Gary, how did you discover these? Is this what came out of the discussion with the guy you met in the forum?
Yeah, I met sort of my counterpart at VMware and just struck up a conversation with him, explained what we were running into. And he said, oh yeah, these should help.
Everything in conch.
And so they're literally undocumented. There's no place where these are enumerated or.
Well, I actually found a website that this guy probably spent years poking at it, and he's documented maybe 75 different parameters. Quite interesting.
Okay, but that's like documented in an unofficial way, right?
Yeah, and the guy says this is unofficial.
Yeah.
VMware apparently does not intend to publish this.
I'm sure they want to change them at a moment's notice.
Yeah, it's their internal knobs.
Yeah.
Keep your hands off it.
On the other hand,
Yeah.
the
This,
fact
this
that
is
they're there
why,
means they have to rely on them, which means if they change them, they hurt also.
this is why if we got VMS listed as one of the items in the drop-down menu, these kind of things could be set automatically.
Yep.
And that's the whole purpose of that drop-down menu. So I don't think we should give up on that.
Oh, of course not. But I mean, Claire, what's the likelihood of,
Okay. There's a meal now.
I'll be happy to go to Australia.
I'm sure it's just
I
their
mean,
money.
after years, I couldn't take it anymore.
moving on. So once we've made that change, we're pretty much we're in good shape at this point. So we're ready to actually complete the creation of virtual machine. At this point, you'll see our virtual machine called Bootcamp is there along with several other virtual machines that are up and running. The guy's powered off. When you select it using the box there, you'll get this window. And when you press the go button, if you're lucky, you get this. And at this point, you should be in pretty good shape. This will show you, well, what I've done between here and there is I have telnetted to my console window. This is the port number that I gave it when I created it. And If you're at all familiar with Boot Manager, this stuff should look pretty familiar. We're now booting. Get the progress there. Once it's complete and the ISO itself starts booting, you get that. And voila, you have a VMS virtual machine. Questions?
So first, the MAC address is the same would apply logical lands, for example, anything that overlays the
Oh, yeah.
address. Yeah. So that was the first one. The other one is for performance reasons. I know other emulators suggest you reserve CPU cycles, for example, and reserve the memory chunks. Have you guys done performance metrics with various?
We haven't done that. As Paul will discuss at the next session, if you're going to use fiber channel pass-through, you must reserve the memory. All of the memory that's allocated to that virtual machine must be locked in the hypervisor's working set, so it doesn't get paged out.
To satisfy the driver.
Yeah. But
Oh.
to answer your question, we have not done any performance characteristics regarding whether or not reserved memory for a non-pass-through system will have any impact on performance.
And you do the same thing with CPU, right? You can say, okay, it's going to be for CPUs at this.
Yeah,
reserved.
I don't think we don't tend to oversubscribe ever, right? So we always have plenty of CPUs for a virtual machine.
So when you set up the serial console, we run the progression with only name types were supported. That name type mechanism.
I don't think that,
What you just showed me there, it looks like.
well, it works perfectly. I was not aware that that was a document, only named types were supported.
It's, so it could be what this gentleman said, it's only, it has to be licensed. If you use the free flavor, you don't get that.
Okay,
And but you aren't licensed, is that legal?
well, that's definitely licensed, yeah.
So what we're doing here with Telnet, that requires an enterprise or an enterprise plus. Which means you're at the top tier of VMware cost there.
So that's what I read, just.
Well, Camille, can you run that licensed without an enterprise license? I mean, it doesn't license imply enterprise?
There is a pipeline free license to install.
Oh.
You still have to get a license key, but it then enables it in face mode.
Oh, okay.
There's a basic license, there's an essentials license, there's an essential plus license, gets a mess.
And it's getting worse.
One thing I will say, using a named pipe and setting that up with a system that can only access over SSH gives you the security
That's what we're.
that Telnet doesn't give you.
Right, yes.
So I would recommend using a named.
And that's what's in your install guide, actually, setting up.
We
that
set
data.
both of them. We have both the.
Yeah.
Hey, Gary, almost like Bob wanted to chime in.
Yeah.
Well, no, finish this topic first, then I'll.
Go ahead, Gary.
I just like to take a moment and point out one thing too, that there's been some confusion about who you're actually talking to when you connect remotely. The boot manager and hence VMS before, Azure booting, it doesn't know anything about Telnet or main pipes or any other connection method. This is a connection to the host. The host talks to all of the guests through UEFI protocols, right? So when people say, I need a Telnet connection to the boot manager, no. This is the Telnet connection to your VMware host.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, obviously, that's, as
Yeah.
you saw, I was
It's
literally.
obvious to us.
That's,
It's
no,
obvious
it's
to
not.
us, but it's not obvious to other people.
Yeah.
I get a lot of problems logged, saying, well, the boot manager has to support something other than Telnet. Well, it doesn't even support Telnet. All right, this has nothing to do with the boot manager. This is
An observation.
a remote system in VMware.
Go ahead, Bob.
An observation. It's also a phrasing problem in the documentation. It says, connect to Telnet, connect to your console using Telnet. it should say, we should pick a phrasing which indicates you're talking to the EFI maintenance processor. Effectively, you're talking to the maintenance processor, and that connection is telnet, not,
No, you're not talking to a maintenance processor, you're talking to an emulated serial port.
yeah, you're talking to an emulated serial port, which would be connected to the maintenance processor on a real physical machine.
No. No, it's a serial port that you talk to using I/O from the emulated processor in the virtual machine. It's not a maintenance processor.
But by being semantics, the point is you're not talking to VMS via a serial console.
Yeah, well-
You're talking to the machine via a serial console.
Yes, but
I think Rob sees what I'm trying to distinguish
yeah, I get that.
imperfectly.
There's a couple of other things that I found. One, you use Windows, you use the name pipes into Windows. There's a bit of software out there which feeds on to the person who is called serial over internet, Ethernet, and it will then turn those COM ports back into telnet ports you can telnet into. So you telnet into the Windows system with the main pipe and into the system, so you get network access. It's right, if you've got Windows guest on there, I'm quite sure there's something there in the mixed world.
There's also freeware name pipe proxy servers that, you know.
But I haven't used this, but I know North has, but the guest console you recently introduced, the OPA0, again, mitigates the need for some of this, even with the standard license, right?
Yeah.
You don't need the flags, American Express credit card.
Yeah, and Gary's done Herculean efforts to make the guest console as good as it is. But, you know, as was said in earlier sessions, we really don't expect you're going to be using the guest console for normal daily use. It's really just kind of a stopgap to get things up and running here.
But then we also don't expect it to be emulated serial.
Observation, for quite a while now, I stopped manually setting up things like VMs. I set up a prototype with all the settings set correctly and stash it in my pocket. Then clone it and play with processor count, memory size, et cetera, because that way you will never misspell a parameter or forget a parameter. And the follow-on to that suggestion is I had to set that up myself. There's a finite small number of VMs that are supported. Hint on the distribution kit, a simple 2-processor minimal profile
Template.
that people can just cut and paste and
Well,
see those settings on.
this gets back to the appliance mechanism.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
basically, yes,
Yeah.
basically clone the appliance, customized to your needs.
Need on this sooner or later.
That is how you started again. Yeah, we're going back to the beginning.
And so, Greg, you're comfortable with it not being a refrigerator then, I guess.
That's just, we're gonna get into that exact same conversation on VirtualBox. Okay, every one of them, it's a pipe organ. Stop, create a dummy appliance, clone the dummy appliance, change the name, change the this, change the that, continue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll get a lot less support. I'll put it in VSI's best interest. You'll get a lot fewer support calls.
Yeah, I agree.
Any other
Some
questions?
people in here heard this before.
Yeah.
What were the disk type and the network adapters that you went past pretty quick on the one slide?
Okay, let's see. So those are the network types. And the 3 that we support here are E1000, 1000E, and the VMX Net 3.
Okay.
And the VMX Net 3 theoretically should be a little slightly better performance because it's para-virtualized. I don't know that in reality that's actually true, but that's the theory.
That was introduced in there too.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
There's discussion on ESXi, so all the DRAM too much of it, just not getting that circuit there, network types for NVM this
I am not a KVM person, so I can't answer that. Oh, well, I know that there's a pair virtualized driver for KVM. Yeah. And so Keith, you're asking about the disks?
The disk adapter
Yeah,
that you suggested.
yeah. So you've got SAS should work.
SATA, SCSI, VirtIO.
Oh, okay.
And VirtIO is only, I think, KVM.
Right, but I guess, okay, so your point is on ESXi, one really does need to use the SCSI.
SCSI or SATA.
Okay.
I don't want to say something I do quite a bit. I'm not sure this is fully supported, but it's good. No. You can create multiple SCSI adapters, and you then set the disk to share. You can connect them to two SCSI adapters. Now that gives you multi-pathing in AVM. I'm not saying you really want to use it. If you want to do DCL or look at management of multi-pathing, which is something I do, I do that, and I can bring up multi-pathing.
As the multi-path maintainer at VSI, I cannot recommend that, but. I mean, I'm also not sure what that would be. Yes, I mean, it wouldn't buy you.
It's not buying, it's buying configuration.
Sure, absolutely,
Not
yes, yeah.
anything in.
It's not.
But if you want configuration reports.
Yeah, that should, all kidding aside, that should work, and if it doesn't, let me know, but, that is not something we've tested. Anyone else? So if you have, if you've got any other storage related questions, even completely unrelated to this is a reasonable time to ask them, because both Paul and I are here and we can field your just generic VSI storage questions too.
How do we enable the iSCSI interface?
Noted.
So just a point, if you use Telnet to connect to a virtual serial port, by default, Telnet keeps the entire line local and does not send the entire line until you hit return over the network. It also appends a null character at the end of the line. So what you need to do, especially if you're using the VMS Telnet, you go into the Telnet, you get the Telnet prompt and go mode character, and then you'll get back to sending a character at a time to the serial port to better emulate the serial port. If you use PuTTY, there's a whole bunch of options in there to make it a raw serial port.
Paul, these list of known settings needs to be in at
I
least.
believe that is been documented.
Yeah, it really, I worked that out for Kermit and PuTTY manually. Believe me, it has to be published.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Yeah.